How reliable are the arm wrestling contest and the race for scaling in Demon Slayer? People don't seem to agree on how much we can actually use from this. Should we completely disregard them? Are they perfectly valid for scaling? Or are there aspects that we can use for scaling? You've probably seen these talked about several times before. I'm not going to open these up with the same one-dimensional scaling and simplicity that most people analyze with. I will be using physics, biology, and actual sword mechanics to come to a conclusion. I'm going to actually be putting logic behind this and not saying, oh, he can do this, therefore he can do that. I'm going to start with the arm wrestling contest, and I could throw the arguments that you've all heard before. This doesn't include Marks, this is before the Hashira training arc, and Moichiro's amnesia nerfed. But I'm not going to do that. First, we need to understand why people use this in the first place, as there are different things you can use it for. For example, I think this is a good example of the fact that torque and leverage are used within Demon Slayer. Arm wrestling favors tall people as they are able to generate more torque. Torque is at force times distance from the pivot, giving taller people an advantage in arm wrestling, which does line up with sword mechanics. Taller people have longer arms, which leads to them generally having more mass on them. They have a bigger distance from their elbow, which is the pivot. But arm wrestling doesn't take into account speed. It does take into account torque, and the value of torque is acceleration, but not only does arm wrestling require little acceleration and general velocity, but swordsmanship isn't only based on your arms, which we'll get into later. But the community doesn't use the arm wrestling contest to show consistency for torque and leverage being a factor in Demon Slayer. They use it for strength. So we need to analyse whether the arm wrestling contest is a good measure of strength, and we also need to analyse if the muscles used in arm wrestling matches match those of swordsmanship. We don't know the rules that the Hashira played by, as people use different rules for arm wrestling. It's kind of like pool in a way. There is an official set of rules, but not everyone plays by those specific rules when they are playing against their friends. So the arm wrestling contest is already ambiguous, as we don't know the specifics. But let's say they are all using proper technique, which is unlikely, but let's even the ground. Arm wrestling technique involves using your body weight, bringing your elbow close to your shoulder, and using leverage to gain the advantage. This benefits characters like Tengen, Sanemi, and Gyome, who are heavier and have longer arms, which allows them more leverage. Whilst it's unfavourable towards Obonai, Moichiro, and Shinobu, who are either light or have shorter arms. Also, for Shinobu, we don't know when this takes place, so she could be 37 kilos and therefore have an extremely unfair matchup, or she could be 74 kilos due to the poison in her body, which further adds to the ambiguity of the contest. If you watched my previous video, you may argue, but Treb, leverage, torque, and mass are all important for swinging a sword. And to that I say yes, that is true. But there's two things wrong with that argument. The first thing is that these factors aren't pure strength. You're arguing that height is important for swinging a sword, not strength results from the contest. The second is that velocity is a huge factor for how powerful a sword swing is. Kinetic energy is velocity squared. Velocity is a bigger factor than torque and mass. But is there even technique being used here? The author has put this in here for a reason. As a community, we've gotten too comfortable just disregarding statements and scales, even though that's not what the author intended. The fact that the word strong is being used means that this wasn't a battle of technique. This was put here to provide some sort of strength ranking. I can throw all the technique stuff I want at this, but it doesn't change the fact that the word strong is used. It's clear that this is meant to serve as a scale for the Hashira's strength. Oh yeah, never mind. This panel in the extras of volume 11, chapter 96, the chapter right after the arm wrestling contest, we learn that yeah, technique is being used here. Therefore, this is not an accurate measure of strength, and I haven't even gotten down to the muscles used in arm wrestling. Arm wrestling uses your arm muscles. Shocker. These are the majority of the muscles used, but your shoulders are also a pretty big factor depending on technique. And speaking of technique, with good technique you can activate your rear delts, and depending on the rule variation, you can even use your chest muscles. This is actually a surprising amount of muscles that gets used for what is called arm wrestling. However, your hips and legs are not included in arm wrestling, which is important. You use your hips and legs to help swing a sword. It allows you to put more force and momentum behind the swing. But of course you can't use momentum if there is no velocity. Arm wrestling simply relies on too much technique and doesn't mimic the physics behind swordsmanship. The contest is arbitrary and ambiguous in nature, and is even implied to be a false measure of strength.